not least because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And since their enemy was these new Republicans in North America, and the enemy of their enemy was in London, so therefore London was their friend. And then London, of course, particularly in the War of 1812, which I know that is going to be marked in Canada.
Big time.
Curiously unremarked south of the border. And one of the lessons, it seems to me, and as I write about in this book, that Canadians in particular should take away from the War of 1812, was that it was an attempt by the United States to annex Canada. Just like the United States waged war against Mexico. And it took a lot of Mexican territory, including California, and now the most populous, richest state. And one of the many reasons why the United States wanted to annex Canada was that after the rise of the Haitian Revolution in particular, that Canada had become a sanctuary for capital flight in the form of Africans.
Us.
Right. Massive capital flight, fleeing northward. Follow the North Star to freedom, as the song went at the time. And this was enraging the slave-holding class. So the United States wages war against the British Empire and in an attempt to annex Canada. In fact, in the demented dreams of some of these hawks in Washington, they wanted to control all of the Americas, from the Arctic Circle down to Tierra del Fuego. I mean, basically. And fortunately, they were stopped. And one of the reasons they were stopped is because during the War of 1812, what happens is that Britain then makes an appeal to the enslaved Africans. And so when Washington is sacked, plundered, and pillaged, August 1814, James Madison, the diminutive, ill-tempered U.S. president, chased into the streets with his garrulous spouse Dolly at his side. As the formerly enslaved Africans looped the White House and helped to burn down Washington, as Negroes with guns are fleeing after James Madison. Then, in that context, you have enslaved Africans from Virginia then defecting to British lines, and then the British then transport them to Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants still reside. They're called Americans. So when I was spoken last night in New York, one of the descendants of the Americans, a sister from Trinidad who then migrated back to New York, was telling me about her family, how they had escaped from Virginia on British ships to Trinidad and Tobago. As I said, where their descendants still reside. So this book is a lot about this conflict over slavery, where Britain had moved towards abolition, the United States was digging in its heels. And that created a dynamic whereby the Africans were then aligning with London against Washington. And this takes place particularly as you begin to have ships full of enslaved Africans sailing from the breeding state that was Virginia, and by breeding state I mean what I say, where Africans are bred, and then transported to these so-called new territories, particularly Texas, but even before Texas, to Mississippi, for example. So they're transported by ship, and then sometimes they're blown into Bermuda, and which is just offshore from the Carolinas, you may recall. And then the British freed them, to the consternation of Washington. Then it's a particularly important case in 1841, where you have the ship Creole that's sailing from Virginia, supposedly to New Orleans. The Africans rise up, kill their captors, sail into Bahamas. The West Indian regiments with the Negroes with guns under the Union Jack come on board the ship, free the Africans, let some of them go to Jamaica where their descendants still reside. This, of course, infuriates Washington, because it's not only capital flight, but they think it sends a dangerous signal to the Africans, particularly in Florida, that if you can escape to Bahamas, which is just across the street, well, you can be free, and even if you kill somebody, you can be free. They think this sends a dangerous signal, is worthy of war. Doesn't happen. And just to fast forward, the picture on the cover of this book, which for those who cannot see it, is a picture of these Africans with guns under the Union Jack. What happens is that, I found that many Canadians may not realize, interestingly enough, that one of the founding fathers, if not the founding father of what is now British Columbia, was this man of color, Sir James Douglas, from what is now Guyana. And after the United States rips off California from Mexico, then of course you have the gold rush. Gold is discovered in Northern California, and people are coming from all over the world, particularly Australia. And given the tension between Washington and the British Empire, and I should mention in this context that in that time, 150 years ago, 160 years ago, sometimes it was easier to get from Sydney to San Francisco than from New York to San Francisco, because there was no Panama Canal. If you were taking a ship, you had to go all the way around the southern tip of South America, or go to Panama and then take your effects off the ship, and then they're transported across land, and then, it was very cumbersome. Or then you had to, or you could try to go across on a wagon train and fight your way every step of the way against restive indigenous people, as they were called. So you had these Australians flooding into San Francisco, and tensions between Washington and London were so severe that Australians were being lynched, because they were seen as the vector of British expansionism. And Negroes were being lynched. It's an interesting coincidence. So what happens is Sir James Douglas in British Columbia, as tensions between Washington and London are rising over the West Coast, basically, as look, he sends a message to the Negroes in San Francisco, saying, you all should move to Vancouver. I mean, you can vote. Discrimination will not be sanctioned by law. Look, I'm the governor. I got melanin. I mean, in the United States today, you have one black governor, Deval Patrick in Massachusetts. So they all move in mass from San Francisco to Victoria, BC. What is now Victoria, BC? And at a time of growing tension.
Was this around the time Jimi Hendrix? Some of his people probably some of his people are from British Columbia.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So this is a picture of these Negroes from the time. So I'll stop there with this book, and let me just talk a few moments about this other book before time expires. This book is about Hawaii, and it's part, in a sense, of a trilogy. The first book in the trilogy, Race War, White Supremacy and the Japanese Attack on the British Empire. Actually, there's a lot of Canadian history in there too, because you might recall that Canada suffered a pulverizing defeat in December 1941 when Japanese troops overthrew British rule in Hong Kong. A lot of Canadians were killed, taken prisoner. But the book actually begins in 1853 when the U.S. ships sail into Japan, and Japan has reason to fear that what had befallen Hong Kong in 1841 when it was colonized, and what was happening in China as China was being colonized and carved up by the European powers, was about to take place in Japan. And so Japan goes through this amazing transformation over 15 years, and emerges as an imperialist power itself, waging war on China by the 1890s, colonizing Korea by 1910. At the same time, you have the Hawaii Kingdom, which is a very sophisticated political entity. Hawaii being this archipelago 2,000 miles from the North American mainland, a very beautiful country, by the way, and having diplomatic representatives all over the world, worried about the growth of U.S. imperialism. And so the Hawaii Kingdom works out a deal with Japan, whereby Japan will send laborers to Hawaii, which was also part of a diplomatic deal. It was a hedge against the rise of the United States, but it didn't work because the United States overthrows the Hawaii Kingdom in the 1890s and turns it into a colony. And then, by the way, also says that it sets an apartheid system where only those of so-called pure European descent can vote, which outrages the Japanese in particular, because even today, in 2012, the plurality of the population in Hawaii are of Japanese origin. And so this creates tensions that leads to World War II, December 7, 1941, when Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. But the second part of the trilogy is the White Pacific, U.S. imperialism and black slavery in the South Seas after the Civil War, published about 5 years ago. Because the Hawaii Kingdom was also trying to stop this new slave trade. You know, these people in the United States, they were into slavery, trust me. One of the reasons why Jamaica was so militant in opposition to the United States, not only Jamaica, I would say Barbados and the rest of the islands as well, because when these U.S. ships would like sail into Kingston or Ocho Rios in the 1840s, any dark-skinned person walking around, they just grab them, put them on the ship. Next thing you know, you're working on the cotton field in Texas. I mean, really. And not only that, but even those of pure European descent, if you were walking around, they grab you too, because then they say, you know, you're just a light-skinned Negro. You ain't white. Get out of here. You know, we're not buying that. You'd be working on the cotton field too. And so, after the U.S. Civil War, you know, they hadn't. The profits in slave trade were so tremendous, you know, oftentimes up to 1,600, 1,700%. I mean, you know, please. People will sell their own firstborn for a 1,600% profit. Are you kidding? And so what happens after the U.S. Civil War, these people didn't have their fill of slavery, so they moved to the South Seas and started enslaving Melanesians and Polynesians. And the Hawaii Kingdom, they interfered because they felt that this was a danger to their own people, which was true. And so for their troubles, they're overthrown in the 1890s. So that leads to this book. Hawaii becomes a colony, apartheid state, apartheid archipelago. And what happens is that this union from the west coast of the United States, the International Longshore and Warehouseman Union, sends organizers there in the 1930s. And it's not long before they've organized the entire setup, particularly sugar workers, pineapple workers, and stevedores, people who unload ships. This leads to charges of communist infiltration. So they repeatedly put the union leaders on trial, try to jail them, try to destroy the union. But unlike the United States, when you have these anti-communist trials, when you have these trials in Hawaii, the workers go on strike, there are general strikes, mass strikes, they ask for more wages. It's interesting, they sort of put a tax, the workers put a tax on the state. In other words, whenever the state would try to jail their leaders and put them on trial, they would ask for more money from the bosses. So that serves as a disincentive to the bosses. So they were taxing the ruling class, basically. So in any case, when Hawaii is taken as a colony, the idea was that it would enter the United States as this conservative bastion. But by the time the 1950s rolled around, it was obviously a colony where the left had strong influence, as strong as anywhere in the hemisphere, I would argue. So they wanted to back away from statehood, but they certainly didn't want independence. And they couldn't back away from statehood easily because now the United States in the 1950s, as you know, it moved away officially on the rhetorical level from apartheid. And they were waging these wars in Korea, about to wage war in Vietnam. They thought it would look bad if this colony of predominantly Asian people were rebuffed by the Union, because it would seem like it was racism. Well, actually, it was just anti-communism. But actually, it was probably racism too, because the idea was they also didn't want any so-called non-whites serving in the U.S. Senate, because they felt that they would support civil rights laws, which turned out to be true. So this put them in sort of a vice, and so finally they capitulated and allowed Hawaiians in the Union. Now it's interesting, when I first started giving talks about this topic, if you put my name and the name of the current U.S. president into a search engine, you find some interesting results, because one of the characters in this book is this guy, Frank Marshall Davis, who's the leading black communist in Honolulu. And he's also mentioned in the U.S. president's memoir, except he doesn't mention his full name. And it is, I helped to amass this relationship, which of course has the right wing. They're hysterical, because now they're saying Obama's the Manchurian candidate, the Kremlin's man in the White House. Actually, some of the more hysterical blogs say that Frank Marshall Davis is actually his father. Actually, I even read one of the blogs that said I was his father.